Hello, my name is Dr. Tina Armstrong, and I am an assistant professor of clinical psychology, as well as I'm the director of clinical training in the Graduate School of Psychology for our doctoral program. So that would be our PhD and our PsyD programs. And today I'll be introducing the book of Joel. Joel is really a communal witness of hope amidst despair. The themes of hope and resurrection, and even hope and restoration, I should say, really resonate with me. As an African-American woman, there have just been times where I needed hope. There have been times where life circumstances and challenges have really pained me. But before I go there, I want to talk a little bit about kind of my inspiration, or kind of where my hope comes from. Of course, being a believer, my hope ultimately comes from God, but I have some pictures here. And these folks in these pictures really serve as hope for me. They really help me to draw on something bigger than myself when I have difficulties, when there's problems going on. It also reminds me, as I think about the book of Joel, of how God acts to rescue his people. Hence, I bring this little bonsai tree. I wanted to capture this feeling of, and I'm sure you've all seen them online or in other places, of like that one blade of grass or that one little stalk of corn growing amidst cement, or growing in the side of a rock, or growing in a really hard place. I think that's a message in Joel. It was a really hard place for the people. Yet God, the all-supreme being, encountered his people when they cried out to him. He didn't leave them. He encountered them and spoke directly to them. So Joel opens up with a community experiencing the worst possible calamity. And the book of Joel offers several poems, a collection of poems that kind of lead us through that. And I would say that Joel chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, the outpouring, the future hope, the day of the Lord, that's the part that just grabs me, because at an appointed time, a very specific time, God will pour out his Spirit. God will shower his people with abundance and life-giving rains, and all flesh will experience this outpouring. We all get to share in this intimate connection with our Lord. This outpouring will be for all of God's people. The other interesting piece about that little passage there's two scriptures, is it begins with, "And afterward, I will." So people who face pain and loss, they need an afterwards. They need to know that there is the potential, that there's something more than what they're currently experiencing, that there is hope, that their circumstance and situation, that their hardship can change. We need an afterward even now. And in that afterward, God pours out his Spirit, as I said before, on everyone. Those who are historically on the margins are included. Now, I'm not a preacher. I am a psychologist. I wish I could preach, but I can't. But I tell you, that right there, that would preach. I wouldn't be doing it, but somebody could do it. That's a moment to say, hallelujah, that those on the margins are included. They are central to the story. They are named in that afterword. There is an appointed time, and those who are on the margins become central to the message of God, because he pours out his Spirit on all flesh. Joel chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. The Lord will pour out his Spirit, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants, in those days, I will pour out my Spirit. The word of God.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Listen, I want to take just a minute to say welcome to everyone that's with us this morning. Uh, we are in day 2 of our MLK lectures. And let me say this on behalf of the administration, the faculty, staff, students, even our extended community here at Fuller Theological Seminary. We're so glad to have you all with us today. Here we are in day 2 of our MLK 2021 celebration. We are honored to have each and every one of you with us. Yesterday, we had the joy and the privilege and the pleasure of hearing from Reverend Dr. Otis Moss in our chapel, Otis Moss III in our chapel, and he brought and preached a phenomenal word. And today, we continue this conversation. Our theme this year for our MLK lectures has been, if not now, when? As we have been revisiting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, The Other America. In this speech, Dr. King outlines a triple ghetto of race, poverty, and human misery. And today we're going to dig into that. Today we have the privilege of hearing from 3 renowned speakers and scholars and practitioners. Immediately after we've heard from them, from their presentations, we're going to engage with some Q&A, some conversation, some time to really dig deeper into what they've presented to us this morning. My name is Dr. Dwight Radcliffe. I am the academic dean for the William E. Pennell Center for Black Church Studies. And again, we're honored to have you. Let me say just a few things about our guests this morning. Our first panelist, first presentation will be from Dr. Marne Campbell. Marne Campbell is an associate professor at Loyola Marymount University and the chair of the Department of African American Studies. She received her PhD in history at UCLA in 2006 and holds a master's degree in African American Studies. Her book, Making Black Los Angeles, explores the intersections of race, class, and gender in early Los Angeles. Her study emphasizes issues of labor, politics, and culture through the intersection of this diverse community with other communities of color. She has completed an extensive database of almost every African-American family in Los Angeles from 1850 to 1910. She has published essays in the Journal of Urban History as well as the Journal of African-American History, African-American Women, Wealth, Accumulation, and Social Welfare Activism in the 19th Century, was published in the Journal of African-American History, and considers the integral role of African-American women in securing rights for their community, such as equal education and public transportation. This article also connects their experiences with those of Black women in the North and South during the second half of the 19th century. Currently, Dr. Campbell is working on a book about crime and punishment in early Los Angeles. She created a database of every criminal record between 1830 and 1900, noting crimes committed, race and gender of the victims and defendants, and sentencing. This book will explore the role of race and gender in the shaping of the local criminal justice system. Marne is the recipient of several academic awards, including the University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship and a Mellon Fellowship from the Huntington Library. Her research and teaching interests focus on the middle 19th and early 20th century urban US. She has taught a range of specialized courses on US religious history, history of the West, gender history, and history of Los Angeles, as well as surveys of American and African American history. Welcome, Dr. Marne Campbell. Our second presentation will be given by Dr. Christin Fort. Dr. Christin Fort is a clinical psychologist who is deeply invested in the integration of the disciplines of psychology and theology. Her commitment to the field of integration is demonstrated in her teaching, research, and clinical practice. Specifically, Dr. Fort's areas of academic research lie at the intersection of church teachings or doctrine and their implications for mental health and relational well-being. Her academic publications and current research focus on offering more robust theoretical grounding for the integration of psychology and theology, attending to issues of race and intersectionality. as well as providing practical frameworks for using these theories in clinical contexts and in ecclesial settings. Dr. Fort is also co-director of the Multicultural Peace and Justice Collaborative, an innovative collaborative research team that is intentionally multicultural in membership and focus. As a practicing psychologist, Dr. Fort is honored to walk alongside clients who struggle to find meaning and purpose amid their pain. This experiential knowledge of the ways that human beings search for and create meaning in the midst of suffering serves as a catalyst for her research and offers practical application points in her role as a professor at Wheaton College. She is delighted by the opportunities that she has to serve the church and society in each of these spheres of influence. Welcome, Dr. Christin Fort. And last but not least, Dr. Luke Bobo. He serves as a director of strategic partnerships for Made to Flourish, a pastor's network based in Overland Park, Kansas. Prior to that, he worked for 15 years in the marketplace as an engineer before pursuing an MDiv and a PhD, then serving as the executive director of the Francis Schaeffer Institute at Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis. Dr. Bobo recently spent time as a professor of Christian ministry studies at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri, and wrote curriculum for workplace ministry. He is a visiting instructor of contemporary culture at Covenant Seminary and teaches practical theology for Cruz Institute of Biblical Studies. He is also the author of Living Salty and Light-Filled Lives in the Workplace, a layperson's guide to biblical interpretation, a means to know the personal God, and race, economics, and apologetics. Is there a connection? And co-author of Worked Up, Navigating Calling After College and Discipleship with Monday in Mind. He has been interviewed by Ransom Fellowship, Windwriter Institute, Christianity Today, and the New York Times. Dr. Bobo currently serves as the Minister of Christian Education at Friendship Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri. He is married to Rita Holmes Bobo. They have 2 adult children, Brianna Amber and Caleb Avery. I am so privileged as the academic dean of the Pinnell Center to present this morning, speaking on race, poverty, and human misery, Dr. Marne Campbell of Loyola Marymount University, Dr. Christin Fort of Wheaton College, and Dr. Luke Bobo of Made to Flourish.
Thank you for having me here today. I especially thank Dean Radcliffe and Ms. Samuel for inviting me. As a historian, I was always interested in how the past connects to the present, and this event provided such a good and unique opportunity to make one of those connections. The words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. rang true then just as they do now, and if ever there was a time for us to take action, it is now. 54 years ago, Black people faced similar problems as we do today. Problems of race and racism. More specifically, Dr. King identified the underlying issue in his speech, The Other America. He said that African Americans were living in a triple ghetto, one of race, poverty, and human misery. At the same time, white people were experiencing much more prosperity. White people were being invited to live in carefully designed suburbs, while urban Black people were forced further into low wages, poor living conditions, and for a good portion of the community, large numbers of unemployment. Much of this, Dr. King attributed to racism. The definition he used was the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. What he saw happening in Black communities throughout the country was that Black people were constant targets of racism and in various ways, including racial violence, unequal applications of the law, and discrimination in employment and housing. And he recognized them as structural issues, many of which I believe he would identify today as continued problems facing the African American community. This is why his speech resonates with me so well today. It holds up. If we were to hold a giant mirror up to America, what would we see? We would see that racism and racial injustice are alive today and are living up to their very foundational patterns and practices. Black unemployment, in spite of what the president has said, is still higher than that of whites. And now with COVID-19, those Black people and working poor have lost a lot of their income. And there are several reasons. Either they fell victim to the virus, or they lack the adequate healthcare offerings that are available to others. Many are essential workers who are already on the front lines of the virus, so chances of them getting sick are higher. And those people like me who have the ability to stay and work from home are less likely to get sick. Also, it could be simply because they've been unable to keep or find work because of COVID-19. And I want to acknowledge that there are so many healthcare workers and first responders who are people of color, and they are in hospitals and emergency and urgent care units. Their lives are on the lines every day, and they are putting themselves at risk to help others. And these are people of color. A lot of them are people of color, which presents major problems for the Black community as a whole, communities of color as well, and the rest of the country. It's the result of a tiered problem that affects everyone. As I mentioned, this is an issue for workers on the front lines, many of whom don't even have the adequate health care to get the proper treatment. And some of these people are nurses, medical assistants, EMTs, and other healthcare workers. If we don't have the healthcare workers to tend to the sick, who's going to help us? As we have seen over the last 9 months of COVID, the more people who get sick mean there will be more people who get sick. It just keeps multiplying, and Black and brown people have the highest rates of COVID. Again, the more it spreads, the more people get sick. If you're out of work because of COVID, how can you afford to pay your bills? Right now, Congress is trying to pass a stimulus bill, and they're actually fighting over how much money would be enough to help people. In his speech, Dr. King argued for a guaranteed minimum income for all people and their families. He believed that it was time for the movement to shift in that direction, noting that our country spends so much more money on our military. At the time, he was talking about the Vietnam War and for space exploration. When he ran for president last year, Andrew Yang argued for universal basic income for all Americans and believed that everyone should receive $1,000 from our government. Well, Yang was not elected president, and Congress can't decide whether $600 or $2,000 is enough money to help people who are struggling. On the one hand, we could say that the spirit of the idea lives on. And on the other, we can see that the denial of assistance to those who are in dire need, who are also mostly people of color, is one way that structural racism works in this country. It's not the outright discrimination that's detrimental, and we can discuss whether that still exists, but it's the societal structures in America that are detrimental to the financial stability of our communities of color, along with working poor white communities. Another point Dr. King made in 1967 was one about housing. So as he was describing the ghettoization of Black people, he argued for fair and equal housing. We have seen recently too many examples of how that never manifested and is still a problem today. Urban communities are under-resourced and over-policed. Many inner cities have become food deserts, lacking fruits and vegetables along with other healthy options. Most of them don't even have the same grocery options as in suburban communities. Social and public services are few and far between in several urban communities. Many people who live in these communities face slumlords who neglect to tend to buildings' upkeep and safety. Those who do live in subsidized housing face restrictions that it puts a real burden on families. Rules for housing, such as you can't be married or live with your partner if you're in subsidized housing. People who have been convicted of a crime can't live with you. Violating these rules can get you evicted from the premises, and none of those rules addressed the violation on Black and Brown families who live in them. And those communities are seldom near city centers that have good transportation, that are considered safe, and are even pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods. These communities are also over-policed so that you have more of a police present in Black and Brown communities. We've seen such an uptick in police violence over these last several years in the news, but Black and Brown people living in these neighborhoods have seen and felt it all of their lives. Over-policing also leads to other legal problems that impact Black and Brown employment, education, and households, all of which are necessary to maintain a successful functioning community. Though Dr. King did not discuss education in this particular speech, not to the extent that he would in others, I want to take a moment to address how the current educational system has upheld some of these structures. Funding for schools in many states is supported through property taxes. If you live in a neighborhood where people rent, there's less money generated for the schools in that community. So people who live in suburban communities, or what we consider nicer neighborhoods, where parents are likely to own their homes, will have more funding go into their schools. Not to mention that their children can benefit from better fundraising and parent involvement opportunities. Zero tolerance policies can also be found in public schools, particularly those in inner cities. This is a real problem because if your child is found in violation of certain rules at a school, they can be expelled with a few options to go elsewhere, with very few options. And these zero tolerance policies are things like if your child gets caught with Motrin, Advil, aspirin, because she's menstruating and she has cramps, she could be kicked out of school. Small things like that. Sometimes they're very, very trivial. And recent research has shown that Black boys and girls are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than white children. Moreover, Black preschool children are also being suspended and expelled in frighteningly large numbers. By creating zero tolerance policies, we have created ways for children to become undereducated, schools to operate as practice for prisons, which is why we call it the school to prison pipeline, and an overall system designed to disqualify generations of Black and Brown people from the workforce at any level. So you see, structural racism is cyclical. It is an unfortunate cycle that comes back around to the same issues. We no longer need to discriminate if the country's power structures are hierarchical and based on race. Just as Dr. King said, it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good quality job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It's much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine integrated education a reality. He underscored the need for genuine equality in his speech. Today, we might call it equity, among other things. As we look back on this speech, we must ask ourselves, how far have we come? We might see ourselves not that far down the road. Yes, we've made tremendous strides in the fight, but there are still miles to go. The question is, how can we do this? Well, I do not pretend to have all the answers. There are people out there who are doing great work in this area. I'm also impressed by the important work that Black Lives Matter is doing. First, making it a point that the sheer acknowledgement of Black lives, placing equal value on Black lives, was such a tremendously necessary point to make. Although sad that it had to be done, it was so important for them to make that point. Black Lives Matter has also done a wonderful job advocating for Black and Brown people across the board in terms of family, education, and housing, to name a few. Most people identify their work organizing protests against police violence, but many of their interests are very similar to what Dr. King lays out in his speech, which is also an indicator that we have quite a ways to go in our quest for equality and equity for Black people. We need to address structural issues. We can start by admitting that there are structures in place that give privileges to certain groups over others. We can also start seeking ways to overturn those structures to make our society more equitable, and not just along racial lines, but along gender lines as well. Dr. King suggested legal ways to make change occur. He firmly believed that you would not change people's hearts initially, but that you can change their habits. He gave examples of making it illegal to lynch. He gave the example of making it illegal to lynch a Black man, that an anti-lynching law, which we've never had, would deter white men from doing the lynching, and eventually the lynchings would stop. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was confronted by Black Lives Matter protesters who were fed up with the senseless killings of Black people by the police. I remember her saying, "You cannot change the hearts and minds of people, but you can change the law through legislation." Clearly a connection to Dr. King's speech. I'm not sure if her answer was sufficient for that particular audience, but I think that it was a fair one. We need to have equality and equity in this country, not pity and prayers. Whenever we hear about a killing of an unarmed Black person, those in power always tend to send thoughts and prayers to the family of the deceased. Again, that is not what we need. We need action. We need consequences. We need to know that our lives matter just as much as anyone else, and our safety should be secured, especially in our own communities. Dr. King had an idea: ensure proper representation in government. He said, "There is a great deal that the Negro must and can do to amass political and economic power within his own community and by using his own resources." Malcolm X also believed that Black people should control their own social, political, and economic resources in their community. While the two men differed greatly, they both saw the same thing, that Black representation is important. We need to have representatives from the bottom to the top in governing, from our school boards and county supervisors to our local judges and state representatives, all the way to the national stage. We cannot allow people who do not represent the best interests to get into our best interests to get into office, and then not ensure those interests. We need to hold them in check as well. Let's not stand for the same miserable representation that upholds racist structures, and let's hold those elected officials accountable for doing so. Let's also hold our friends and colleagues accountable for being complicit. Challenge them. Don't be afraid to have those uncomfortable conversations about race. So many are afraid to discuss race or don't know how to talk about it. Some won't even understand it unless you guide them through the discussion. And let's not overlook when we've been complicit ourselves. Let's take into account what and if there's anything we can do to help bring that change. Do we speak out against injustice? Continue voting for that same miserable representative because we know their name? Have we completely given up on the entire system because it's broken? If ever there was a time for action, it is now. If we thought things were bad in the 50s and 60s, what about now? We have not come as far as we may think, and today I have given several examples of that. So now it's our turn. We can take action and demand change, and when it comes, we will know that Dr. King's work was not in vain, that it was just the scratching of the surface toward racial justice in America. We have to do our part too, and hopefully you have a few ideas after this talk today. Activism is alive and well in America, and there's plenty of work to be done at the polls, in our communities, churches, and schools. If you don't know where to begin, start with education. Teach others about anti-racism and how they can be anti-racist. Engage people in the work of anti-racism scholars and writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Ibram Kendi, Isabel Wilkerson, Carol Anderson, Michael Eric Dyson, and Robin DiAngelo, to name a few. Be willing to work with people on anti-racist practices. We need this in our schools, our colleges and universities, our jobs, and our churches. While at times this may seem small, we have to be willing to change the culture in which we live in order to see real, meaningful change. Thank you.
Hello. I'm grateful for this opportunity to be with each of you in this shared space of reflection, contemplation, and celebration of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the entire civil rights activism community. I want to begin by offering my thanks to Dr. Dwight Radcliffe for his invitation to participate in this MLK celebration, as well as to Aaron Samuel in the Pinnell Center for Black Church Studies, and Bianca, Andrew, Reed, and the entire tech team from Fuller Studios for helping to make this gathering possible. Special thanks also to President Mark Labberton and to Deans Ted Kosey and Amos Young for their ongoing work to continue the interdisciplinary legacy of Fuller Theological Seminary in this new season. As a proud alumna of Fuller's historic schools of psychology and theology, I am grateful for the foundation that was laid for me as a graduate student, a foundation that took seriously a cross-disciplinary understanding of God, God's people, God's word, and God's world. That foundation has shaped every aspect of my personal vocation and has also shaped the message that I offer to you today. So with this in mind, I begin by sharing that I am delighted to be here with you all. Although we are separated by time and space, the timeless nature of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's message binds us together in this period of human history. As I reflect on the nature of MLK's message, The Other America, I am struck by the remarkable specificity of Dr. King's historic context in 1967, as well as the continued relevance of his message for today. Dr. King's speech is socially located at a very particular period of both American and world history. This speech, offered in the wake of the full thrust of the American Civil Rights Movement and in the midst of the Vietnam War, is a call to action. It is a wake-up call for the American people to begin to practice what they preach. That clarion call rings as loudly today as it did so many decades ago. In his speech, The Other America, Dr. King reminds his audience that the work of genuine equality is far more difficult to attain than the work of desegregation of school systems or the work of integration of neighborhoods. Ensuring that all aspects of the American population, especially the African American or the American Negro, have full and equal access not only to voting rights, but to the right for clean water, nutritious food, sustainable housing, and a living wage is, he declares, the natural outflow of the fullness of what the civil rights movement hoped to achieve. Dr. King notes that discussing the realities of Black people's access to food, shelter, and clothing is tied up in the complexity of the larger Black American experience of what he calls the Triple Ghetto. The ghetto of race, the ghetto of poverty, and the ghetto of human misery. Dr. King's attention to the connection between these three realities is a perfect example of the necessity of a relatively new term that has gained increasing attention in many academic circles, namely the term intersectionality theory. Dr. Lisa Boleg, a social psychologist, defines intersectionality theory as a theoretical framework that posits that multiple social categories, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and the like, these social categories intersect at the micro level of individual experience to reflect multiple interlocking systems of privilege and oppression at the macro social structural level. This includes examples such as racism, sexism, and heterosexism. In other words, the word intersectionality is another way of affirming the reality that every aspect of our social location impacts our experiences on both an individual and a systemic level. Put another way, the burgeoning fields of intersectionality research have produced new language to describe an age-old reality, one that Dr. King directly addresses in this speech. The reality that what happens to our bodies always impacts our minds and our spirits. And of course, the reverse is also true. I'd like to take the rest of our time today to focus on the impact of these intersecting realities. As a scholar whose research foci lie at the intersection of psychology and theology, I'd like to help us dive a bit deeper into the realities that MLK began to explore in his message. This triple ghetto, the ghettos of race, poverty, and human misery, represent the intersections of many factors, including internal and external experiences and individual and systemic realities. The fact that Dr. King includes human misery in this sobering trifecta is a testament to the depth of pain that both racism and poverty can cause. And I want us to focus on that pain for a while. Research tells us that poverty, or the experience of a very low socioeconomic status, is correlated with a wide range of poor mental health outcomes. A study published by a team of medical doctors and public health researchers in 2018 stated the following: poverty is one of the most significant social determinants of physical health and mental health, intersecting with all other determinants, including education, local, social, and community conditions, race or ethnicity, gender, immigration status, health and access to health care, neighborhood factors, and the built environment, such as homes, buildings, streets, parks, and infrastructure. The mental health effects of poverty are wide-ranging and reach across the lifespan. To be more specific, these researchers go on to say that poverty in childhood is associated with lower school achievement, worse cognitive, behavioral, and attention-related outcomes, higher rates of delinquency, depression, and anxiety disorders, higher rates of almost every psychiatric disorder in adulthood. Poverty in adulthood is linked to depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, drug overdose, homicides, and suicide. These realities are astounding and appalling. The individual and familial impact of poverty is far-reaching and severe. And it is important for us to acknowledge that these impacts are ongoing. Far too often, it is easier to be reductionistic rather than holistic in our assessment of reality. It is easier to look at a big and complex problem and to oversimplify. Psychologically speaking, this is a cognitive and emotional shortcut that we take to make the world feel less overwhelming to us. But unfortunately, this oversimplification of the reality of pain in all of its forms, not least of which is poverty, also oversimplifies the solutions that we come up with as well. The same research team mentioned above also emphasizes that poverty leads to mental health and developmental problems that in turn prevent individuals and families from leaving poverty, creating a vicious intergenerational cycle of poverty and poor health, both mental and physical. To highlight the complexity of the connections between poverty and emotional or psychological well-being just a bit more, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration states that the relationship between mental illness and poverty is complicated. Poverty may intensify the experience of mental illness. Poverty may also increase the likelihood of the onset of mental illness. And at the same time, experiencing mental illness may also increase the chances of living below the poverty line. For those of us who have had the experience of changing income brackets, whether moving up from a working class family to a solidly middle class household, or moving out of an upper middle class lifestyle to a lower middle class or working class lifestyle because of changes in our financial circumstances, we are often able to pause and to reflect on the impact of this change in our financial circumstances, the impact that these changes have had on our emotional, mental, or relational well-being. For those of us who have moved into a more financially secure social class, we may be mindful of the following: a decrease in stress, worry, or anxiety connected to paying our bills, a decrease in a sense of helplessness, discouragement, and depressive symptoms because our hard work is finally paying off in a way that it never did before. For those who have experienced trauma or a genuine threat to our livelihoods or physical well-beings, then we have been able to move out of that traumatic environment, whether that traumatic environment was a neighborhood marked by community violence or a household marked by physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. When those who have experienced trauma move out, they may notice a change in symptoms that were once connected with post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps the triggers of loud noises, like the sound of firecrackers that remind you of gunshots, have decreased in your new neighborhood. Or if you've moved out of a family situation that was full of tension, whether that was arguing verbally or physical fights, if you've moved out of that situation into a more emotionally regulated environment, perhaps you've seen the decrease in your heart rate. Perhaps you've begun to breathe easier, to breathe more deeply. Perhaps you've noticed a change in your sleep. You are no longer sleeping at attention like you once did. The quality of your sleep has improved and you can breathe more easily. These three examples of changes in someone's experience of a mental health diagnosis, like generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder, are all examples that are correlated with or connected to changes that can take place in one's emotional well-being because of a change in social class. In each of these examples, the ability to regain your emotional footing is impacted by your ability to gain financial stability. For those of you who may have never had any of these types of lived experiences before, hopefully these examples help to highlight for you the importance of understanding the connections that exist between income or access to material resources and mental health. I have offered these examples in order to emphasize the importance of what I like to think of as experiential knowledge or experiential understanding. Unlike intellectual acknowledgement of a fact, experiential knowledge of something shapes the depth of our awareness of reality. Anyone can tell you that living in poverty, that struggling to put food on the table, or gas in the tank, or even to put $10 towards a growing credit card bill is painful and hard. But until you've touched these realities, until you've been impacted by them in an up close and personal way, then the depth of these realities is almost impossible to fully grasp. I don't say this to suggest that everyone needs to give up whatever material resources they have in order to taste poverty. That isn't possible. And even if it was, the attempt to do so would simply be another sign of great privilege. But I do say this as a sobering reminder to all of us that our capacity to love, our capacity to love well and to care for the material, emotional, and spiritual needs of others, that capacity is wrapped up in our capacity to move beyond mere head knowledge, to move beyond the facts. As followers of Jesus, our call, really the summation of our vocation, is summed up in the command to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. I am convinced that it is impossible to love those around us unless we understand the depth of their experience. My conviction about the necessity of our call to step into the pain of poverty and the messiness of mental health issues is confirmed when I look at the life of Jesus. In one of the most remarkable New Testament passages on the power of divine privilege, Philippians 2 tells us that Jesus chose to give up his access to the rights and privileges that he had as a member of the Godhead in order to take on human likeness. Jesus put on flesh and blood. And in so doing, he gained experiential knowledge of the depth of pain and human misery that Dr. King so aptly describes. The impact of Jesus' decision changed everything. It is because Jesus decided to take on flesh and to dwell among human beings, as John chapter 1 describes, that he is able to represent us in his high priestly or divine role as one who is able to sympathize with our weakness, as Hebrews 4:15. Not long ago, many of us took time out of our full schedules to celebrate the coming of Jesus to this earth. During the season of Advent, we quieted our hearts, even if only for 60 seconds at a time. And we reminded ourselves that God became a human being. The metaphysical mystery of the incarnation is that God became man. But the miracle of the incarnation is that God became Emmanuel, the one who dwells with us. One of the most famous prophecies related to the coming of Jesus is found in Isaiah chapter 53. In this passage, the prophet tells us that the Messiah, the anointed one, would be a man of sorrows and one who was acquainted with grief and familiar with suffering. As I reflect on the life of Jesus and the words of Dr. King, I cannot help but walk away with this conviction. As followers of Jesus, we too are called to be women and men who are acquainted with grief and familiar with suffering. In a year in which the entire globe has been turned upside down because of the havoc wreaked by COVID-19, the bloodshed that continues to be spilled at the hands of the police, rendering the bodies of men like Jacob Blake useless, and snuffing out the lives of women like Breonna Taylor, the call of the Church of Jesus Christ is to be acquainted with suffering. What does it mean to be acquainted with suffering? It means that we know suffering. We know it inside and out. We know what it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, what it sounds like. We have this type of intimate awareness of suffering because we are in it. Sometimes this means taking time to practice mindfulness in the midst of our own suffering. Sitting with the reality of our pain or the pain of others before we jump in to fix it. An example that readily comes to my mind is the example of suffering with a headache. For those whose minds immediately jump to solutions, your first thought might be, where can I find some Advil? But if we take a moment to really sit with our pain, we may make some important discoveries. Sitting with pain usually involves paying close attention to the situation to see if we can find answers to some important questions. For example, when did I develop this headache? Has it been here for a while and I'm just noticing it? Why do I even have a headache? Am I dehydrated? Have I had too much time in front of a screen? Am I emotionally overwhelmed by the text message that I just saw, so I am somaticizing the problem? Somaticizing is a fancy way for describing the fact that our bodies sometimes hold the emotional pain that our hearts don't even yet know how to process. Perhaps the most complicated answer to all of these questions is all of the above. But the answer to these questions is always revealing. They not only help us understand the root or the cause of the pain, but the answer to these questions help us understand what the most appropriate and the most comprehensive solution might be. I believe that much of the time, the strategy applies that we use for pain, like understanding our headaches, is similar to a type of strategy we might use to understanding systemic pains, like the pain that is associated with poverty. For many people, especially those who are financially secure in the evangelical church or the church at large, a knee-jerk reaction to the observation of someone else's poverty is often reductionistic and individualistic. Reductionistic in the sense that we far too often simplify the issue and engage in what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. With the fundamental attribution error, we falsely attribute the cause of someone else's suffering, someone else's poverty, for instance, to their poor work ethic, or their disinterest in rising out of poverty, or their simple laziness. Honestly, even saying these words out loud brings a feeling of great disgust to my body. For millions and millions of the American poor, and the poor around the globe, this false attribution has nothing to do with reality. The church is also individualistic in our approach far too often, when we overemphasize the importance of personalized, individualized care for those who are suffering, which of course is of great importance, to the exclusion of attending to the systemic needs that heighten the person's or the families or the community's experience of poverty. One way to combat this way of thinking and behaving is to move beyond the concept of, for instance, adopting a family for Christmas, a marvelous gesture, and to move to choosing to adopt a family for the year. Perhaps this adoption process is a more holistic way of meeting a family's entire set of needs. This adoption could include providing job coaching for parents, tutoring for children, bus tickets or gas money for the household, therapy for the dad who needs to process the racial trauma connected to the death of a loved one that he witnessed at the hands of the police in his neighborhood. And yes, perhaps even adopting that family involves purchasing gifts for the family for Christmas at the end of the year. But this type of systemic investment in a family is reflective of an intersectional understanding of their lived experiences. It marks a more complex understanding of pain and suffering, as well as a holistic understanding of health and healing. This type of communal intervention, when the whole church family steps in to meet the holistic needs of an entire household, this type of intervention plants the seeds of change that can lead to transgenerational healing and restoration. But this type of systemic change, this appreciation for the intersectional nature of human existence, requires taking a good, long look at pain. As humans, especially humans in the Western world, we really don't like to do this. For many of us, our coping mechanisms for pain are wide and vast. We ignore, deny, minimize, distort, and lie on the truth. It is easier to do things that way. And while I believe that our capacity to use coping mechanisms in the face of pain and suffering is actually a gift from God, I also believe that our ability to use coping mechanisms wisely and well is a skill that must be honed and a muscle that must be developed. Friends, while it is easier to ignore, deny, minimize, and distort pain, both our pain and the pain of others, I want to tell you that the way of Jesus is to look at pain in the eye, to face suffering head on. Our call is to acknowledge the fact that the pain of physical suffering is heightened because of mental and emotional suffering, and that the pain of emotional suffering is exacerbated by poverty and inequitable access to material, psychological, and spiritual resources. This is the truth. It is the deeply painful truth. But, my friends, it is only part of the truth. The other part of the truth is that we are Christ's ambassadors. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 tells us that God, in his divine display of delight to partner with human beings, God has chosen to use us to further the divine mission. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul tells us that as the body of Christ, God is making his appeal to the whole world through us. The hope of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ that Dr. King preached, and that you and I, as the Fuller community, have committed ourselves to live out in both word and deed. This good news is holistic in nature. The good news is that we have a God with experiential knowledge of pain and suffering, who wants to bring redemption and restoration that begins with this life here on earth and continues on into the age to come. This good news is that the pain of poverty and suffering is real, and God knows that. This is why in Jesus' inaugural announcement of his lordship, that he proclaims that the good news is specifically for the poor. This good news is not only for the spiritually poor, but it is for those who are materially poor as well. It is a declaration that the God who sees everything, who sees the ravishing nature of poverty, has sent his Son and his Spirit and his people to come in and to intervene. He has inaugurated his kingdom on earth, and we are witnesses to the ultimate freedom that will come when he returns. Beloved, this news is only good for those who realize how bad, how painful, how broken, how utterly hopeless the realities of this world are in the natural. And things are bad. The depth of poverty that is experienced by those all over the globe and by those right here in our midst particularly the ongoing, complex, transgenerational, racially laden poverty that experienced by African Americans of slave descent today. This is a horrifying reality. It looks so ugly that many of us would rather shut our eyes to this reality. But, beloved, I am convinced that it is only as the church realizes the role that we have, the role that we're meant to play in ushering in this divine kingdom, a kingdom not only involving the saving of souls, but the assurance that there will be a quality of life, even here in this material body. That when the church realizes our role, then we are able to be the witnesses to this great and glorious news in the way that we are called to be. In the final section of Dr. King's speech, he says, "We must come to see that social progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And without this work, time itself becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. And so, Dr. King says, we must help time. And we must realize that the time is always right to do right. Beloved, our response as the church is to do right. Our call is to act, not only to think or to talk or to study or to pray. Our call is to act. And I believe that our choices, our individual and collective choices to do right, these are the spiritual and material manifestations of the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let it be so. Amen.
Many thanks to Dr. Radcliffe and the fine staff at Pinnell Center of Black Church Studies. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in his 1967 speech entitled The Other America, spoke about three ghettos, three slums where the African American finds himself or herself: the ghetto of race, the ghetto of poverty, and the ghetto of human misery. I've been asked to expound on this ghetto of human misery. Because of the historic fall of man, all persons live with some degree or some threshold of human misery. To use the Apostle Paul's language, we all have a thorn of human misery to negotiate. However, for the African American living in America, he or she is waiting to exhale, because the African American living in America has been given a larger thorn of human misery to contend with. And while this human misery might be rightly attributed to many factors, I will focus primarily on the African American struggle to secure and hang on to economic dignity. That is, I will argue that the underemployment and joblessness contributes mightily to African Americans' human misery. Before continuing, however, let me say this as an aside. Black people represent 13% of the US population, 61.2% of which are middle class. In other words, according to a Brookings report dated February 27th, 2020, and entitled "The Black Middle Class Needs Political Attention Too," the Black middle class is growing. So we should celebrate this achievement. Progress has indeed been made. But according to Michael Strand's book, The American Dream is Not Dead, Blacks as a group are noticeably less upwardly mobile than white Americans. This is troubling, and that is another source of human misery. And that's another topic for another time. I want to address what's right in front of us. Dr. King said in his 1967 speech that the unemployment rate, rather, for Blacks was twice that of whites, hovering around 8.4%. But if he counted the discouraged persons, those who had exited from the unemployment pipeline, the unemployment rate was more like 16%. Today, according to the Economic Policy Institute, African-American workers had the highest unemployment rate nationally at 6.3% in the first quarter of 2020, before the pandemic raged out of control. This 6.3% rate for African-Americans was followed by Hispanic workers at 4.8%, white workers at 3.1%, and Asian workers at 2.9%. Again, because many African-Americans were likely discouraged, many likely dropped out of the game. So that unemployment rate is likely higher, perhaps around 12 or 13%. I find this shocking, considering, again, African-Americans make up a mere 13% of the United States population. And I also find it remarkable, considering we live in the great America, the land of plenty, the land of abundance, the land of the free, the land of opportunity. I submit that human misery continues for many able-bodied African-Americans because it seems like we are perpetually in a position of pulling up the rear. And because less encumbered access to a flourishing economy exists for some and not for all. My colleague, Dr. Amy Sherman, defines a flourishing economy this way. A flourishing economy is one that respects the freedom and dignity of all, that offers all opportunities for the deployment and exchange of their talents, and that is safeguarded by the rule of law so that fair play reigns and all people have the opportunity to become self-supporting. A flourishing and just economy is one that frees people to do good. What I am suggesting is that the human misery that many African Americans experience in this country of the free and the brave is related to their limited access to opportunities to become self-supporting. The opportunity to exercise their human agency by fruitfully employing their natural gifts in the economy. These limited opportunities are what I argue is the basis in part for the human misery that many African Americans still experience in the 21st century. As Imago Dei bearers, image bearers of God, we were created to worship God through our work. There's dignity in work because we are introduced to our God in Genesis 1 and 2, not as a king, not as a redeemer, not as a savior. Of course, God continues to serve in these roles. However, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we are introduced to God as a worker. God works, we work. Work gives our life purpose. Work is a cure for boredom and idleness. Work is a cure for sadness. My wife lost her job in February of 2020. Sadness filled our home. My wife was not sad because she made an idol of her work. She was sad because she could not contribute. She was placed on the sideline of life. Because so many African Americans are deprived of deploying their God-given gifts, imaginations, and abilities in the marketplace, many suffer from what Arthur Brooks, former president of the American Enterprise Institute, calls a dignity deficit. Imagine being equipped to do something, but not permitted or blocked to do it. This reminds me of Viola Davis' 2015 Emmy speech. She said this: "In my mind, I see a line. Over that line, I see green fields and lovely flowers and beautiful white women with their arms stretched out to me over that line. But I can't seem to get there no how. I can't seem to get over that line. Davis was quoting, of course, Harriet Tubman, who said this in the 1800s. Now check that, the 1800s. Davis went on to say, and let me tell you something, the only thing that separates women of color from anyone else is opportunity. You cannot win an Emmy for roles that are simply not there. I remember as a teenager not being picked to play pickup games of basketball and football. I had the ability and the desire to play, but I was not picked. That was hurtful of not being chosen to play, to belong. So imagine being equipped with skills and abilities, but not being chosen or picked to cross over the economic color line to opportunities to earn a paycheck. Imagine the psychological pain of not being able to get over this line and to grace the threshold of a company to work, to belong to a community. Imagine how cruel this is to someone who knows how to work and wants to work, but cannot get over that line. This having the ability to work and the desire to work, but limited opportunities, exacerbates this human misery for African Americans. Human misery is compounded because many of these unemployed or underemployed African Americans are parents who must accept help from outside the home. So imagine the humiliation that many parents experience when they cannot buy their kids Christmas gifts, but they must accept gifts from strangers outside the home. Their kids grow up thinking help does not come from within the family unit. Rather, they grow up thinking help comes from outside the home. Yes, as Brian Fickert writes in his book, When Helping Hurts, our good intention helping can actually wound and distorts one's view of work, or it could distort their work view. Human misery for the African American is magnified by this truth. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Blacks have significantly less wealth than whites. Over a third of Black families have either negative wealth or no assets at all, according to my colleague and sister Mersa in her book, The Color of Money, Black Banks, and the Racial Wealth Gap. Why should this wealth gap matter to us? Again, Mersa, my colleague and sister, says this: it is the wealth gap where historical injustice breeds present-day suffering. It is the wealth gap where historical injustice breeds present-day human misery for many Blacks. Think of wealth, money, security, and real estate as analogous to the level of water in a bathtub, while income is analogous to the flow of water into the tub, writes John Pender and others of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service. So if we stick with this metaphor, that of a bathtub, many African Americans have a rather low level of water in their bathtubs, little income coming in, and a large drain where money flows out. Or think of it this way. Many African Americans have no water line in their bathtubs at all. Pope Francis wrote this in his book, The Joy of the Gospel. Until exclusion and inequality in society and between peoples is reversed, it would be impossible to eliminate violence. The poor and the poor peoples are accused of violence, yet without equal opportunities. The different forms of aggression and conflict will find fertile terrain for growth and eventually explode. When a society, whether local, national, or global, is willing to leave a part of itself on the fringes, no political programs or resources spent on law enforcement or surveillance systems can indefinitely guarantee tranquility. Exclusion from the economy has driven many to heap more misery upon themselves. As Michael Strand puts it in his book, The American dream is not dead. Men without work are often men up to no good. My colleague and friend Travis, who pastors in West Virginia, can attest to that because he knows of young men who cannot find work and have resorted to opioids. I hope you're connecting the dots. If we can get people out of the unemployment, underemployment spin cycles and help them to find good paying jobs, crime and violence can actually decrease. So how do we relieve our African-American brothers and sisters of this human misery so that they can exhale? Let me suggest 5 things. Number 1, ask why. At the beginning of the 20th century, historian W.E.B. Du Bois acknowledged that African Americans have made progress. That's undeniable. And he also said this progress was unequal, incomplete, and accompanied by wide gaps and temporary retreats. So instead of our default, which is to assume, we need to ask why. Why is this progress unequal, incomplete, and still accompanied by wide gaps? Why does it seem like we are perpetually in this position of pulling up the rear? We need to ask, why does this large wealth gap still exist between whites and blacks? We need to ask why we're still having this conversation about human misery of African Americans in 2021. Some 54 years, if I did my calculations right, some 54 years later since Dr. King coined that phrase in the first place. We're still having this conversation about human misery, and we need to ask why. We need to ask, why is the unemployment rate so high for blacks as compared to whites before COVID and will likely be after COVID? Once we answer the why question, then we can move to the next step of seeking a comprehensive remedy. Number 2, see others rightly. As my colleague Karen Pryor Swallow writes in her book On Reading Well, justice begins with seeing people rightly. How do you see your fellow Americans? How do you see your fellow African-American brothers and sisters? We must first see all people, especially African-Americans, as not ontologically inferior or as a threat or as a pet. Rather, we must see them as a human being made in God's image, endowed with skills and abilities and dreams and desires. And because every African-American is made in God's image, every African-American deserves to be treated with royal dignity and respect. And because they are made in God's image, they have something to contribute. To work is a way to contribute. Number 3, practice the principle of mutuality. In Jeremiah 29:7, God tells his outcast people to settle down in that pagan city of Babylon, to build houses, to have babies, to plant gardens. He also tells them in Jeremiah 29:7 to pray for the city because, as Jeremiah writes, when the city thrives, you will thrive. Flourishing requires mutuality. Dr. King put it this way: we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Maybe that's why Nancy Pelosi recently said, one country, one destiny. We flourish when all people flourish, especially those on the back row of society. We must understand that our flourishing depends on the flourishing of others, and the flourishing of others depends on our flourishing. Number 4, cultivate the twin virtues of love for God and love for neighbor. Loving our neighbor begins with coming close and listening to our neighbor. Listening comes before responding. Practice Renee Watson's mantra. Great poets listen to their world and then respond back. We must listen to our neighbor and listen to our world, and then after listening, respond back. God wants us to cultivate a hearty and genuine love for our neighbor. much like the Good Samaritan. This love is not static or indifferent. Rather, according to Austin Chaney Brown in her book, I'm Still Here, she writes, this love refuses to see systems and structures of injustice. Brown adds, this love is troubled by injustice. We love our neighbor by caring for our neighbor. It is true that money doesn't buy happiness, but money in the bank helps lift some of the psychological pressures of poverty, of human misery. Let's work together to relieve folks of this psychological pressure of this poverty, of human misery. And finally, number 5, be a champion of justice. The astute Bible reader knows that love and justice are related. Love and justice are the same, for justice is love distributed, writes one writer. We must embody justice. Justice is a core gospel principle. Doing justice is not like an option on a multiple choice test. Doing justice matters to God. If doing justice matters to God, it should matter to us, those that image him. Justice is righting wrongs and rendering what is due to a person. Justice demands action. You see, we are implicated to act justly once we see, learn, and hear of injustice. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, is more forceful. He writes this: we're all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. And the absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, and a nation. We must not only be citizens who see, learn, and hear, but as Christian citizens, we must actively seek justice on behalf of those who cannot. We must seek ways to give all persons access to earn a living. Those bent toward justice realize that to become a just society, a society must bring into community all its weak and defenseless ones, its marginal ones, giving them voice and a fair share in the goods of the community. In his book, Cities of Tomorrow, Noah Tolley writes, justice means addressing structures of discrimination and oppression and creating conditions in which all may flourish. God equips and God calls the church for the sake of human flourishing. That is exactly why the church is not the church if it does not stand for justice. A church not active in pursuing justice undermines its own identity. Likewise, a Christian who is not active in pursuing justice undermines his own identity as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Sure, we've made progress since Dr. King's speech in 1967. That's undeniable. We have elected the first Black president. We have elected the first Black female vice president. However, we must continue working for the invisible rank and file. However, we must continue working for the invisible rank and file. We must continue working until we have restored all African Americans' economic dignity. You see, we belong to each other. We are all Black and white, polka dot, yellow children of God our Father. So let's labor side by side to get folks of all colors to work, especially our African-American brothers and sisters, and thereby relieving our African-American brothers and sisters of their larger thorn of human misery so that they might truly exhale. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Thank you so much. Matter of fact, let's take just a minute to do that, to breathe together. Can we take just a minute to breathe in and to breathe out? Thank you, Dr. Marne Campbell. Thank you, Dr. Christin Fort. Thank you, Dr. Luke Bobo, for the presentations, the wealth of information, the academic rigor with which you presented your information. This has been great and life-giving. And I want us to begin to transition into our conversation. I want to say a couple of things that as we go into this conversation, I want us to have more of the air of a conversation of, can I say, family reunion, picnic in the backyard, kind of sit up and keep it a buck, tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us God. And so I'm going to welcome Dr. Campbell back, Dr. Fort back, Dr. Bobo back, and joining me in this conversation this morning, this afternoon, depending on where you are, is Fuller's own Dr. Vince Bantu. If you are unfamiliar with my brother from another mother, Google him, as we say, his research and his publications, his presentations. He's a phenomenal brother, and it's really dope. I say this, Dr. Bantu, you know, I think it's dope that I get paid to have this conversation, to sit down and chop this up with these scholars, to talk about things that are personally important to me, but are also important to the church, to the Black church, to the Black community, to the nation at large, to global culture, to the global church. So I want us to jump in. I want to give Vince, you've had a chance to listen and hear, and so I want to give Dr. Bantu the opportunity to first respond, and then we'll jump into some questions. Those of you who have not already done so, would you please, if you have a pressing question, would you drop it in the Q&A feature there, and we have some people who will be moderating some of the questions, and we'll try to get to some of your questions, but we're gonna have a conversation this morning, this afternoon too. So Vince, my brother, please jump in. What are you hearing? What are you thinking? What's piquing your curiosity? What are you chomping at the bit to say?
Man, well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Radcliffe, just for putting this together. Hats off to you, brother. And I want to know, can we all just give the Lord a hand praise for Dr. Radcliffe and just thank the Lord for your vision as our leader, my brother. This right here is fire. I'm just sitting here eating and drinking. You know what I'm saying? And this is so much to say. But I also, man, real talk, like you said, we're gonna keep it a buck. And like, I think for real, the thing that I'm just so appreciative of you kind of guiding us into Dr. King's focus, you know what I'm saying, on that intersectionality of race, gender, poverty, all that stuff, with this focus on the other America. Like, everybody, Dr. Ford, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Bobo just laid it down. And I love that emphasis, because this is something that's a heartstring of mine, because we talk about race, but we don't talk about economics a lot. You know what I'm saying? And we have to talk about both, because I'm going to keep it all the way above. I mean, this is home up in here today. And I'm gonna be real. Like, when I think about his speech and what he said, like, in my ways, I'm thinking about my pops. You know what I'm saying? Like, my pops grew up in the Ville neighborhood of St. Louis, which was like the Harlem. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could see Black folks in suits walking around, doctors and lawyers, everybody living in the same community. And really, integration, all that did was just separate the Black classes. That's really. And to the point now where in my generation and the ones coming up after me, we don't see that. And the church, even in the community, is a commuting church. And so that call to like really be present and really to be taking up the call for action and really working towards things like, minimum wage and all that, it's just so much more of like I would even say maybe it's even greater pressing call today, because we at the same time have the greatest resources in the gospel of Jesus Christ, number one, and in the Black church. especially
Yes.
in the Black community, is the greatest resource that gets overlooked by white evangelicalism, that gets, all that kind of stuff. So I just say yes and amen is my first response, but I know we're gonna chop it up.
Yeah, yeah. Let me quote a little bit of the piece, and then I want to open up the conversation to our panelists a little bit more. King says, to use a philosophical analogy here, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It's not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it. I submit that however unpleasant it is, we must honestly see and admit that racism is still deeply rooted all over America. Dr. Campbell, you outlined inequity and structural issues. Dr. Bobo, you talked about some of the economic pieces, and Dr. Ford, you named the role of intersectionality point blank. Although Dr. King didn't have language of intersectionality, it's absolutely what he's detailing. He's detailing that all these other factors are there, but there's this thing called race that comes alongside of them and amplifies them and makes them worse. And since we said we were gonna keep it a buck, when my wife and I have a chance to talk to couples, we talk about sex and marriage being a multiplier, that if the money is right, sex will make it better. The money is wrong, come on, talk to me, somebody, that it's a multiplier. And when it comes to race, we haven't been honest enough about how race is a multiplier. It's not just the legal aspect of it. It's not just the politics. Is that once you bring race into the conversation, it begins to multiply and amplify either access or restriction. So one of you, please, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Ford, Dr. Bobo, one of you who feels led to jump in right there. Come on, talk to me, holla.
I just want to agree with you. I'm not sure if you can hear me. So I'm probably going to ask, am I audible?
Yes, I hear you.
Good. I just wanted to agree. It's so true. As a person who does marital therapy as well and thinking about all the different aspects of our lives that intersect, I just want to say it's so true that whatever's going on in the backdrop of our lives is always going to impact what's in the foreground. And of course, that can be reversed as well. And it's really important for us to be paying attention to the things that are really easy to ignore. I mentioned that in my message earlier. It's easier to say, oh, that's not the main thing I'm supposed to be focusing on, or I'm used to just pushing through. Had a couple of therapy sessions earlier this morning with women of color, and part of what we talked about is this trope that we just make it, we figure it out, which we do as people of color broadly, as Black women, as brown women specifically. However, it is important for us to acknowledge that when we ignore the things that are beneath the surface, they always find a way of seeping out. And how do we take some time to actually acknowledge what the seeping is doing to us individually? You talked about in a couple's relationship, and I'm not married, so I can't speak to it in that particular way, but I know watching, observing, it always seeps out in every part of your life. And it's important to at least name it. So I want to affirm that and hear from others as well.
I just add this, we are integrated beings, which means financial stress impacts our psychology, our physiology. So you cannot separate one from the other. We don't live compartmentalized lives. So again, amen to what you said, Brother Radcliffe.
Yeah. And isn't it, Marnie, before you jump in, and isn't that, I don't know if we're ready to go here yet, but isn't that lie, that myth of compartmentalization, isn't that a descendant of Greco-Roman civilization and philosophical thinking that allows us to buy into the fact that we can actually bifurcate our lives, separate our lives, that section is over there, this section is over here. But the blessing of our African roots, the blessing of the Black church tradition tells us that no, every aspect of our life is connected.
Yeah, that dualism. Could I just add this one last thing for now? I wrote a little book called Race, Economics, and Apologetic. Race, Economics, and Apologetics. And I talk about this phenomenon called epigenetics. Epigenetics says that if a woman of color experiences racism or discrimination, it impacts a baby in utero.
Yeah.
And even Jewish people throughout the Holocaust also experienced this epigenetics. All that to say, we're not immune. It does, and there's another book out. I haven't read it yet, but I think it captures exactly what I'm trying to say. Your body keeps score.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, to get back to the initial race being a multiplier, is that we identify certain illnesses with African Americans, hypertension, et cetera, and all of that, all of those illnesses are connected to who we are as people in the world, where we are located, our socioeconomic status, our race, right? And our race defines all of those other things. So our race shapes those experiences that push us to certain neighborhoods where historically we've been tied to, and we might be missing, and I know this has been said, but we might not be receiving the right kinds of nutrients and nourishment, right? Or the stress of being Black in this world right now, that can lead to, increased instances of hypertension and things like that. And as I mentioned in my talk, this COVID-19 and how Black people and brown people are not getting the proper health care because of race, is not because of personal choice, and things like that. And so we have to really kind of focus on that. And also then remember, as you said earlier, the Black church, all of these kinds of things, we have all of these things that I'm saying, we are tied, we are one, right? With our experience, we can't separate. And so like our communities, our churches, all of that define who we are. It's not just one thing that we go home at the end of the day and then we can leave something behind, and that's it for me.
Yeah. And what you said there, Dr. Campbell, especially about healthcare, the disparity there, that even I, as when I was in my late 30s, having to convince my primary care physician that as a Black man, they're going to have to do colon screening for me earlier than what Kaiser is telling him he normally does. That having to advocate, my wife, who's had some scares with lumps, has had to go in, and we've had to learn that Black women and women of color, more broadly, Black and brown women, have fattier tissue in their breasts. So we have to advocate for our health more because race now, no other reason, just because race now enters into the fray, and it's troubling. There's a couple questions in here about wealth. So let me transition to a question that I've got, and we'll talk about economics a little bit, and then we'll pivot a little bit more. King says from the same speech, in 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery, but at the same time, the nation refused to give him land to make that freedom meaningful. At that same period, America was giving millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that America was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor that would make it possible to grow and develop, and refused to give that economic floor to its Black peasants, so to speak. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Bobo, you each mentioned some of the nuances of understanding employment and unemployment in the African-American community, unemployment rates and the discrepancy there, as MLK, as King even pointed out. How might that compare today as we begin to talk about wealth, the wealth gap, unemployment? King's thing was he was talking about people that had given up on unemployment. But I think one of the things that we would talk about today is the working poor, right? Those who because they have any kind of job have not been accounted for in the unemployment statistics, but they're working one job, two jobs, three jobs, and still not making a living wage. So they don't count as unemployed, but they're still almost at or below the poverty line. I think, Dr. Bobo, you made a statement like we need to restore, economic dignity. And I can hear the detractors saying, well, how do you restore if they had no wealth? And that's why I bring up King's quote. And I'm thinking Black Wall Street. I'm thinking antebellum and Jim Crow restrictions on owning property that prevented blacks in this country from getting the same floor that some others have said, y'all jump in, come on, talk to me.
Go ahead, Sister Campbell.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bobo. You know, this is hard because there's levels to everything, right? There's so many levels. So one of the things that Black people need to do is really invest in our own. One of the things that that Malcolm X was really I know we're supposed to be talking about King, but and one of the things that Malcolm X was really serious about was the way he defined Black nationalism. And in that definition, it was that Black people were to control their own community, the politics in their own community, which I emphasize, we need to get our own politicians to represent our needs. They had their own, like talking about having your own schools. And he was with the Nation of Islam, as you all know, so they already had control of their own church, but also the businesses in their own communities. And that is something we do not have, but we need to have. And we need to be better about supporting Black businesses, for one thing. And we also need to understand the meaning of wealth and how we can get it, and if we can get it, right? So before Dr. King and Malcolm X, there was Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And one was fighting for the land and the other was fighting for the vote. Right. And we see this play out in various ways in various forms of Black nationalism that come in the 60s and the 70s. And so we went for the vote, really, as a Black community. We really targeted the vote. We did not target the land. So we missed out on some of that. But it's time for us to start looking into how we can invest in our own communities and provide for our own people and not be ashamed of it. Because the other thing that happened while the Nation of Islam was advocating for their own, basically their own system, they were also attacked in the media for having that, right? So you get this mixed message about segregation and all of that kind of stuff. And you have people who are like, okay, I'll embrace this. I'm going to control my businesses, my politicians, and the education of our youth. And suddenly you're the outcast because you embrace that, right? And so as a Black community, we need to kind of think back to that, and we need to figure out, okay, what has the vote gotten us? And if we could get some land, I don't know where that land is going to be. I don't know if we all need to leave and go and find it somewhere. There have been lots and lots of attempts in this country's history. Right here in the state of California, we've had these Black utopian societies that did not last for various reasons, not our own. So now we need to turn our attention to how we can create wealth, because we don't have it. We spend more money than many, many countries in this world. So as Black people, we have the money somewhere. It's out there. But now we need to put it together. That doesn't address the other issues of unemployment and those kinds of things. But we really need to focus on how we can accumulate wealth as a community.
Yeah.
I'll jump in here. I did say for clarification, I did say secure and hang on to economic dignity in the very beginning.
Yeah.
So this is a fascinating discussion. I think one thing we have to do, I believe that African Americans also have the know-how and the capability. Some have the entrepreneurial spirit, but so many have been given so much that they have somehow suppressed their own gifts and abilities. And so I have a book in my library where one guy went to Indiana. He had to reconvince an African-American brother and sister that they actually had gifts. They had talents. So I think that's the first step, because they had been traumatized so much that they realized they thought that they didn't have any skills and abilities. Now, the reason why I believe that African Americans do have the entrepreneurial spirit, and I noticed in the chat, someone said they need capital. So let me tell you about my good friend, Oye Waddell out in Phoenix. He started an organization called Hustle Phoenix. He is redeeming that word hustle. He's finding peoples on the margins of society, Hispanics and African Americans, who have this entrepreneurial spirit. He's providing them what he calls intellectual capital. He's teaching them. He's providing them with social capital. He's surrounding them with a little team of people who have the know-how to start a business. And now this African-American brother is starting his own bank. So he doesn't have to rely on white banks. He can have his own funding to fund some of these entrepreneurs. And I think I work for Made to Flourish, and I do a workshop called Church Assets for the Good of Their Community. I believe God has equipped every church with assets. The biggest asset, the largest asset, are the peoples in the pew. God has uniquely equipped each church with assets to help for the flourishing of other communities. And so what our churches must do, and I'm including our white churches, what would it look like if we combine all of our assets, combine those assets with those in the community that we hope to serve, and that can lead to a long-lasting, sustainable solution.
Yeah.
And I know of churches that are doing it. There's a church in St. Louis where Dr. Bantu lives, Friendly Temple Missionary Baptist Church. They have built apartments for low-income elderly people. They negotiated with the bank to move their location, to build a location right next door to the church as an alternative to payday loan institutions. So God has given us the imagination, and God has given us the Holy Spirit. And I think we settle too quickly. Let's lean on the Holy Spirit. Let's ask God to enliven our imaginations and bring all these assets together for the betterment of our communities.
Yeah.
And if I can speak to that for just a moment. Yeah, thank you, Dwight. As I think about what you're sharing, I'm very mindful of where some of the roadblocks come from. Like, why do we get stuck? Like, how do we get to a point where we might have access to capital, but we don't use it? Or we forget that we have gifts and talents and abilities, as you're describing, Dr. Bobo. And I think it's really important for us to pay attention to this concept that psychologists call learned helplessness. Learned helplessness. And it actually starts off as this experience of actually being helpless initially. So once upon a time, African Americans were, in fact, to some degree, they weren't kind of the masters of their own fate, right? They, in fact, had masters. So their ability to think that if I want to pursue something, I can, right? If I want to get an education, I can. That actually wasn't fully accurate, right? There were so many external roadblocks. And eventually they internalized that external roadblock, where they began to believe I can't do something because I couldn't for so long. And that's inherited, like it's become a transgenerational thing. We've inherited this sense of helplessness because once upon a time, our people, at least economically or in some spaces, were more helpless than not for certain things. And I recognize
Dr. Ford, if I can
already
interrupt real quickly.
Yeah.
Dr. King said this. He said, if the white slave master can get his slaves or her slaves to think that they are inferior.
That's right.
He or she has them right in the place where he wants them.
That's exactly right. When you've internalized that lie, right, you do become trapped inside. And I think when I think about learned helplessness, the example that's often used is an example of an elephant. When an elephant is born, an elephant is already more powerful than most other living creatures, simply because of size and strength inherently. It's literally been granted by God when they are born. But if, for instance, this elephant is in the circus, and we can have a different conversation about whether or not the elephant should be in the circus. But if the elephant is in the circus, right, and the circus master or mistress takes the elephant in infancy and ties a shackle around the elephant's leg, the elephant learns as an infant, I don't have my power is worthless. And so the elephant believes I can't get free. They tie a shackle that actually is strong enough to shackle the elephant in infancy. But when the elephant is older, this process becomes really interesting because the elephant actually can be tied with a rope. No longer metal, no longer something that's actually a powerful thing to keep it bound, but because it has in its little elephant mind this idea that anything tied around my leg means I am powerless, it no longer has the capacity to do what it actually does have the capacity to do, because it remembers what it was taught when it was very young. That idea of learned helplessness, that you're bound because once upon a time you or your people were bound, is something that we have to own as well. Once upon a time we were helpless. We were, and again, I recognize it's a controversial term. It's not the best one, but that's the term that the psychologists use, that you were helpless in these ways. And now we need to unlearn these types of things, and acknowledge I do have more freedoms. I do have many freedoms. And then how do I use those freedoms? And so I want to pause this portion of what I'm saying by acknowledging the importance of social support. A lot of the literature talks about the necessity of being in community, of people who see you and acknowledge and call out the gifts, the strengths, the abilities, the talents that you have. And I'm reminded of a story of my first and second year in seminary. I was at Fuller, and one of my roommates, Rebecca, is an amazing woman, and we would actually share the same room for a year. And during that year, I had these highs and lows of my self-esteem. Like, can I do this doctoral work? I know I did well in undergrad, but can I actually pursue this? I'm tired, I feel stretched, all these other things. And every once in a while, she would take me to our bathroom mirror, and she would take me by the shoulders. And she would say, Christin, come here. And I'm like, okay, like Becky, I get it. Like, we've done this before. Come here, Christin. And I'm listening. So I come over, she put me in front of the mirror, and she would remind me, Christin, you are a strong, intelligent, beautiful Black woman. And she is not Black. And she would look at me and say these words to me. Now I need you, Christin, to repeat these words to yourself. This is who you are. And as I gained the social support from Rebecca, reminding me of who I am, my own self-esteem, my own self-confidence allows me to gain this internal motivation to be able to move towards the things that I'm called to, move towards the things that I love. And so I name that simply to say that this learned helplessness is real, and it was inherited for a reason. Once upon a time, there were genuine roadblocks, and there are still genuine roadblocks. We also need people, community around us to speak the truth to us, to call it out, and to tell us to call that out to ourselves as well. So I just want to highlight that portion of things.
Your story reminds me of the famous doll test.
Yeah. I was getting ready to say that since you brought up the doll test, that in sociology, there is there's a term that's been used called a self-fulfilled prophecy. And so usually that term is meant to discuss or to deal with social deviance, right? So that they used to say Black people were more likely to go to prison. Black males were more likely to go to prison because there's this self-fulfilled prophecy of social deviance amongst Black youth, right? And this is what you're describing. It's the same idea of a self-fulfilled prophecy. But now you have to we in this group have to think about where we are and who we are, and some would say whose we are, right?
Yeah.
And that's a different prophecy.
Yeah.
And Black people need to embrace that.
And it's even why we have spaces like this, right? That we begin to present alternatives to the larger narrative that we are so often bombarded with. There's a couple questions in here that are tied together, 2 questions specifically that are tied together, and I'll read them, and I think we can deal with them together. One is asking, can we talk about the rise of anti-Blackness in other communities of color? And then the other one is saying, why do you think there is such pushback against intersectionality and race, specifically from evangelicals? So I think if we can deal with this pushback, this anti-Blackness, this refusal to address race and intersectionality, first from communities of color, and then maybe from white evangelical spaces in specific. Don't make me jump.
I think the first step is simply to acknowledge the reality, right? To acknowledge when groups don't always get along, when in fact we become our own. My mother uses this term a lot. She used to say in my childhood, Christin, don't become your own worst enemy. Don't be your own worst enemy. Be your own best friend. Be the one who looks out for yourself, who tells yourself the truth, but also surround yourself with people who do that as well. And we as those who have been oppressed historically in this nation and around the world, depending on where we're talking about and who's the colonizer and all those types of factors, it is true that it has become very problematic for us to be people of color. That's already a broad and sometimes problematic overarching category, but as people who have been oppressed, that we're not always seeing each other as equals. And what do? We first acknowledge, yes, I think about this often. As a Black woman, I fall to the bottom of almost every chart for almost everything, except for education. PhDs, Black women, yes, we're doing great. But other than that, we talk about social status, we fall pretty low. What does it mean to own that? And for me, that means owning that in my communities. I have many friends of color outside of the Black race. And what does it mean to say when we talk about any aspect of our lives, whether it's purchasing our homes or pursuing education or relationships and marriage, our chances are different. And not because they ought to be different, but because perception is different about us. And we start by owning the fact as a fact and being able to actually create safety to say, yes, you can be my Korean American friend, and say, yes, I hear you. My people won't date you. Not all my people, but some of my people. And yes, we talk about other groups of people. We own that. We confess that. We repent of that, even on behalf of our people. And then we begin to say, what are our next steps in terms of systems and structure? So that's my initial thought on that.
The comment about anti-Blackness in the Black community, is that what I heard you say, Dr.
In
Radcliffe?
other communities of color.
Pardon me?
In other communities of color. In other pockets of, in other marginalized populations, in other communities of color.
This notion of wanting to separate from Blackness?
Or anti-Blackness, just anti-Blackness sentiment, yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if some of that has to do with the cost of helping African Americans get a leg up. And I would suspect that has a lot to do with some of our white brothers and sisters too, to get into the game from the sidelines into the game means one needs to give up something: authority, power, convenience, prestige. And so I wonder if that has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I think for me, come on, Marnie, go ahead.
I often talk about and I write about racial hierarchies, right? In the ways in which this nation uses race against itself, right? Or uses races against each other. So when you think about the history of our country, when we initially were built, right, it was Native Americans that were targets of racial violence, and then Africans, eventually African Americans, who became the targets of the racial violence. At some point during that time, as we expanded further out west, we started targeting racial violence and racial oppression toward brown people, so the Latinx community. And so we then pit them against each other so that we can sort of, whiteness is always at the top, and we always sort of pit the others against each other so they can sort of fight and scrape to get, to the top or somewhere near the top. But the way we've done it historically in this country is that Black people are always at the bottom, as Dr. Ford mentioned, right? Black people. And then there's that intersectionality piece where then it's divided by along gender lines. And so right now we have what we used to call the model minority, right? There was a lot of focus on Asian Americans from the 90s to the early 2000s. And so we just keep putting people along this ladder, trying to be the top or trying to get to some place in the hierarchy where they're not the bottom. And that's the problem, because if we start to look at one group and say, okay, we're going to help this group, then there's another group then that's going to fight for their chunk. All the while, Black people are fighting for everybody's chunk. Right?
Yeah.
We're fighting to get it for everybody. Equity and equality means everybody. We're not just trying to get a piece for us. Go ahead, Dwight.
And the phenotypical hierarchy that so many of the racial categories all buy into. And then they begin to see the fallacy of it when xenophobia begins to enter into the conversation. then they begin to see, oh, wait, I'm not there either. And so I think one of the peculiar things that we have to address, or at least briefly mention here, I'll just parenthetically insert that when it comes to anti-Blackness sentiment in other communities of color, that as we've kind of addressed here, and when it comes to the pushback against language of intersectionality, critical race theory, all these types of things coming from white evangelical spaces, a lot of it is rooted in the fact that there has been historically a weaponization of Blackness, that Blackness, Black people, the state of being Black, racially, phenotypically, socially, culturally, that being Black, as you all have said, puts you further at the end of the spectrum, puts you further at the end of the table. And so the further you are at the end of the table, the less human you are. And so it's easy to dismiss critical race theory. It's easy to say that intersectionality is not really a thing because you've dehumanized that end of the table so badly. I've spoken about this in other places, but when you hear when you watch the videotapes, when you hear the 911 tapes of how people are assuming the hostility of a Black person simply on their state of being Black. Come on, Christin.
That's so true. Your most recent comment made me flash back. I was driving home 6 weeks ago and I realized there were two men who I often see asking for money on the street corner. They were actually at the off-ramp. They began fighting each other on the off-ramp. I swerved to avoid them as they're fighting. And I thought to myself, I need them to not be hit by those who are coming off the off-ramp, not paying attention. Who do I call? Do I call the police? Since I have this moment, I'm not a fan of calling the police for multiple reasons. And I also am like, okay, I live in this particular neighborhood. Usually I have better experience with the police here than other places. Maybe do I call? I decided to call. And as the dispatcher asked for information, I listened to her leading question. Did you say they were Black? And I say, actually, I'd never told you the race of the people who are here. And in fact, it actually is too dark for me to see. And so even though I might have an inkling of what I'm not, no, come and address the two people who need some help here on the side of the road before they're run over. I think about what does it mean then to have these presuppositions that we have in the back of our minds about many things, often derogatory, connected to Blackness. And what does it mean for us to address that back to the question in the evangelical church, in these evangelical spaces? And again, I think naming things is so basic, but we're not even at square one. If I think about a number line from -100 to 100, we're at -50 or something. So if we could just get to 0, that would be a really important step. We have to acknowledge we're not even at 0. And that's painful. It's painful as the church to do that. But I think it's a really necessary step. The final thing I want to say connected to this at the moment is thinking about another cognitive error that psychologists talk about quite a bit. It's called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error, where you attribute inappropriately an explanation for why something is happening. And far too often, especially in the Western world, we look at someone else when something goes wrong in their lives and we say, you must be lazy. You must not care. You must not have any internal motivation. These are all internal explanations for why your external experience is problematic. But often what we do is the reverse for ourselves, where we say, oh, if I did poorly on an exam, it's not because I didn't study. It's not because I'm lazy. The teacher is hard. This exam was more difficult than we were told to prepare for. There's always another explanation that's external to me. And we have to be careful not to slip into that error in thinking, which is very common. There's so much research behind it, to misattribute the cause of someone else's pain to something that is internal to them, but it's external to me if something goes wrong. And that happens along racial lines quite a bit in the church as well. And we need to be able to acknowledge and address it.
Dr. Ford, your illustration about the Dark Knight and the two gentlemen reminds me of a friend of mine who said, African Americans have to constantly be in this mode of practicing mental gymnastics. A decision is not so clear and cut for the African American in this country.
Yeah,
it's true.
Yeah,
true.
Vince, man, what are you thinking? What are you chewing on, especially as people who have had to navigate a lot of these white evangelical spaces?
Man, it's funny too, because we work together in a white evangelical space, and at the same time, I say on a regular basis, I'm done. I'm done. And I mean that too, because like, I feel like so much of all the things we've talking about just have to do with, I love how Dr. Campbell's bringing in like the nation. And I do a lot of research and work on like more contemporary new Black religious movements, Hebrew Israelites, Kemetic folks. And it's interesting how there's like a tension between like the reconciliation that the gospel calls us to and the justice that the gospel calls us to at the same time. And it's like, we can only see iterations of like one extreme or the other. And I feel like a lot of us in the church have this really pacified, watered down, and as we saw last week, heretical, idolatrous, apostatizing version of Christianity that has been put, I saw in the comments, Yochanan mentioned 4th century. And if we look at 4th century CE, that comes from Constantine. There's this like imperial theology that basically pimps out the gospel and the church in the support and in the interest of power and economics, and basically just expects those that are marginalized to just get on board with whatever is best for the wealthiest among us. And that's how the Roman Empire did things. That's how the American Empire has done things. But the gospel of Jesus Christ, especially among our ancestors in Africa, has always been counter to that. And I think another aspect to going back and reclaiming of Sankofa and going back to reclaiming those roots and rejecting the pacified, puritanical, Gnostic kind of bifurcated gospel that we've inherited from Massa and from all of these other, people, is to understand a justice holistic kind of concept of economics and gospel. The African people who invented monasticism, like Shenouda of Atrib, like Benjamin of Alexandria, like Estephanos, like Walata Peto, they generated Black wealth in the community. They created jobs. They taught people how to read, how to do architecture, agriculture, how to do carpentry. The monasteries were centers of biblical and theological education for sure, and instruction. Also, illiterate people could become literate, and also it was economic production. They were trading with people in the nearby city centers, but they were also an alternative society, knowing that they were not going to be able to make Egypt or Ethiopia look like the kingdom economics of God. But at the same time, that didn't make them go to another extreme of being like, well, we're just going to go out in the desert. That's a false stereotype that people have. We're just going to go out in the desert and be disconnected from the world. No, not at all. And James Goring's Ascetic Society of the Desert demonstrates that clearly. They were deeply involved in society. In fact, magistrates and people of all levels were involved in these African monasteries. They were engaging them, but they at the same time had no problem publicly denouncing these officials and these magistrates when they were making policy decisions that disproportionately affected the poor in Egypt and Nubia and Ethiopia. But we didn't get that Christianity because of, a lot of other reasons that I go into in Multitude of All Peoples. But we got the Christianity of Jonathan Edwards that says, believe in Jesus. Oh yeah, go back there and keep picking my cotton. And so that's heresy. That's apostasy. We need to reject that. And we need to go into a holistic theology that also calls us to not, because again, this is where I'm gonna come at us. We've gone, as soon as some legislation opened us up to be able to go into the suburbs and and we took our churches with us and we built megaplexes, and we keep having more and more money go to pastor, people giving rent money and light bill money to pastor and all this kind of stuff. And we justify that by saying, well, it helps us all to vicariously all thrive and come up with that. I'm like, no, not at all. Again, what did the monasteries do? They had a value of simplicity. They had a value of biblical justice, that it's like, there's a cup on top of a bunch of cups. Once my cup is full, it needs to start trickling in, not just how to make my cup bigger. And that's but we have to go back to that. Reject this capitalistic, puritanical, Trumpian, white supremacist Christianity that's been given to us, reject it all the way and go back to our roots, which actually are more closely connected to biblical shalom, which was already in the Gospels. So
Vince, are you criticizing the Black church?
Luke, Vince would never do that.
Hey, man.
Hey, Vince, I'm gonna need Vince to put up his Cash App in a minute so we can raise his offering a bigger cup.
I think if he gets money, he has to distribute it. That's what I just heard, that if he has a cup that's filled, my little cup needs to be filled up from his Cash App. That's what I heard.
Open the doors of the church.
Hey. And we all going to Sizzlers.
Not Sizzler.
No. We got to support Black-owned business. We got to support Black-owned business. We all going to go to Sweetie Pies in St. Louis. There we go.
That's a whole nother conversation. Conversation. Man, there are, this conversation is rich, and there are, the questions are going in a multitude of directions. And so I want to first apologize if you don't feel, for attendees that may not feel like we're getting to your specific question. Your questions are so so wide. And this is the beauty of having this interdisciplinary conversation, right? And we're all approaching this from various different disciplines and what have you. So let's do this. Let's bring in one more. Let's go back to Dr. Ford. Let's talk a little bit more about the psychological impact of poverty. And I think let's stay there for a minute. And then I think once you start there, then I'd love to hear Luke and Marnie from your fields, riff on the effects of poverty as you see it from your disciplines.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a really broad question. So I don't know if we can find a way to be more specific. There's so many different effects. The first psychological effect that comes to my mind is one that Dr. King mentioned 3 or 4 times in his speech. And the word that he mentioned multiple times was humiliation. I think Dr. Bobo might have said something about humiliation as well in his presentation, but thinking about what it means to be ashamed, to live in shame is really significant for us. And biblically, for just a moment, shame is the first type of affective experience that's talked about in scripture, which after the fall, or before the fall, actually, right? So we have Adam and Eve, they are in the garden and they have no shame for not being clothed. And then we have this experience that Dr. King is talking about of being ashamed or being humiliated by your status in life, by the way, at least other people perceive your status and the reality of your status. And I think, again, acknowledging shame is very, very important. I feel like sometimes I'm saying the same thing over and over, but starting by actually telling the truth that this is reality, that you do feel ashamed. And then to say the reality, for me, for instance, if I've internalized that shame, what does it mean for me to say, not only people tell me like, oh, that you grew up in this area, or you didn't have these types of resources, so you ought to be ashamed, but what do I do with the reality if I believed them? For me, that's a whole nother level of shame when I realized I internalized that classism. I internalized that version of racism. I internalized much sexism. What does it mean then to say that was part of my story, that is part of my journey? Then how do I overcome it? How do I then say, I don't need to be ashamed that this is the social location I was born into. This is the social location that I'm pursuing. And so I think acknowledging that humiliation often suppresses motivation as well. So like there's a good reason that you're like, I don't have any energy to try and get a better job. I'll just stick with the job that I have if I have one. I say, praise the Lord, I have a job. But what if the job is not actually tapping into the gifts and callings that we talked about earlier? What does it mean if this is not a fulfilling or meaningful job, which is something that's become very significant in the 21st century, especially to millennials, to actually do something that we care about, do something we're passionate about, to borrow language that Fuller often talks about, I feel I have a vocation or a calling towards. I have to first acknowledge that I've been humiliated by what I've done so far. I've developed this learned helplessness that I can't get out of it. And then I need to figure out how to say the truth and to surround myself, as I said before, with truth tellers. And then if I need to gain some new skills, gain some new skills. Who can help me gain these skills? And I think one thing I'll say about gaining new skills, practically speaking, that I think is really important is to be mindful of who's teaching us those skills. So I teach at an institution where I don't have other Black women who are tenured at my school. And I think about what that means for me to not have other Black women in my institution who I can look to and ask, how did you get here? What's going on? How did you stay here when in fact you weren't able to stay here? So then I have to ask myself, who do I ask in my institution? And then I have to supplement outside of my institution personally to gain the skills that I need, not only to survive on this tenure track, but to thrive and to flourish. So who's giving me that feedback is important. I need, in fact, Black women telling me how they do tenure life in their institutions, because they know something intersectionally about my journey that other people who are well-intentioned, who are well-resourced, in fact, who love me, won't be able to give me. And so what does it mean then to acknowledge what I've internalized poorly and who can help me supplement that appropriately? I think that's part of working through that shame or humiliation.
Yeah, thank you. Luke, Marnie, Vince, talking about poverty, how do you see the effects of it from your discipline, from your perspective?
A good friend of mine, we call him the Bishop, Carl Ellis Jr., wrote this piece called Ghetto Nihilism. And nihilism simply means a profound sense of hopelessness. And that leads to aggression, and that leads to Black on Black crime. So I think it was Pope Francis who said, as long as there is exclusion, as long as the poor are excluded from making an honors an honest day's paycheck, no systems, no surveillance systems can guarantee tranquility. So
Wow.
poverty leads to this profound sense of hopelessness, this sense of aggression, and ultimately it can lead to fatalities.
Yeah. Marne, Vince.
Well, I'm trying to figure out which direction I want to go with this answer, because for me, the basic answer is, I guess there's two. Without capitalism, we wouldn't have poverty, right? So there's one, but also without capitalism, and it's not to say we wouldn't have racism, but capitalism and racism are inextricably linked. And so this country was built on the idea of rugged individuality um, and capitalism, right? And so we created a system, a hegemonic structure in this country to maintain power, um, that is based on capitalism, but it's tied to race. You can't separate it. And also, gender and all of the other things that we speak of when we're talking intersectionality. And so for us, poverty is always going to be, until we get rid of capitalism, poverty is always going to be tied to race and tied to African Americans. And that is the problem for us. That's a problem that we have to overcome. And that's a problem that we have to face head on. And one of the things I mentioned in my talk that I want to come back to is the ways in which Black Lives Matter deals with this very issue, because Black Lives Matter is looking, again, from an intersectional lens. So they're looking at families, they're looking at women, they're looking even at trans people, trans women of color specifically, and they're trying to find ways to help create a more communal space for people to help each other, rely on one another, and provide for each other, so that the problem of poverty isn't so grave, so that the problem of poverty isn't so that it doesn't weigh you down so much that you can't get out of it, or that you can't survive. And so I think these are some places that we can go to, at least for answers. But because the way our country is, and we see even from what's going on just within the past week, that that we've made such a huge distinction between the haves and the have-nots, and they're so based on color and race, that we have a lot of work to do. And I wanted to just mention one other thing really quickly, and that is the ideas of white privilege and white fragility. And we saw that unfold at the Capitol last week. We're seeing it continue to unfold. And although you might find people that have different socioeconomic statuses in these fringe groups that are attacking the Capitol and those kinds of things, they always have their whiteness and their privilege above African Americans. They always have that. And so doesn't matter if they're poor whites or middle-class whites or whatever, they're always, even poor whites will always have a step above poor Black people, right? And so this is an area that we really, as a community, need to focus on. And I keep saying that over and over again, but I guess I want to drive it home. Like, we need to focus on this, because nobody's coming to help. Nobody.
Yeah, a good friend of mine says we need to stop waiting on Superman.
Vince, did you want to jump in before we move on to? I got two things I want to do before we start looking at wrapping up.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sad. My internet cut off for a second. I missed the middle of Dr. Campbell's great statements there. But I wanted to hear the rest of it, because everything y'all are dropping is gold. But but I heard the last part, and I definitely, would agree about and I heard the first part too about capitalism. And I think about, even like, as a, kind of like Dwight was saying, we got this interdisciplinary thing. So coming from like an early church type of dude as myself, like I'm thinking about some of the interesting things about how there was poverty in the early Roman world and in like early like African context. But I think one of the differences, and I'm not a specialist on the modern stuff, but I feel like one of the differences is that something very insidious and evil about capitalism that isn't there in the ancient like concepts of poverty is in capitalism. It's like you're poor because of you. It's your
That's right.
and like you need to do something about it. And in the ancient world, that just wasn't the case. Like people were like, oh, the gods love me more than you. And so that's all it is. So that's your destiny, right? And so that actually takes
You were a farmer, yeah.
poor, because it's like, well, like, hey, I mean, not to say that that's like a better situation, but again, in the modern world, it's like, and when you have a Christianity, it's not even Christianity. It's heresy. You know what I'm saying? Like, because Jesus breaks it down in Matthew 25 of the characteristics of what his kingdom and what his followers look like. So we have a version or a pollution of Christianity that's really being pimped and is really being driven by that capitalistic spirit that says you're poor because it's your fault and you don't like that about you and you need to get up and get a job and all that kind of stuff. That's when and so again, we need to be able to, white, black, all of us, we need to be able to just boldly declare, look, I believe in unity, I believe in reconciliation, all of that stuff, but we cannot let this unity language drive us into a place of trying to build unity at the cost of justice, because Jesus doesn't do that and God's kingdom doesn't do that. And so he prioritizes the poor, and he does it in a way, Jesus goes throughout the Gospels doing it in a way that pisses people off, religious and civic leaders. And so, yes, we're striving for unity. It's open for everybody. When there is a Nicodemus, even if they want to come at night when ain't nobody west of the Sanhedrin ain't looking, okay, he's like, we can start there. We can, that's
Yeah.
right? Even if there is a Gamaliel or a Joseph of Arimathea, yeah, everybody's welcome. It's not a us and them type of thing. It's all God's kingdom, but it's done so in a way that is unapologetically doing it in favor of and in solidarity with the most marginalized of society.
That's right.
Thank you. Listen, it's almost 12:30. We want to start wrapping up soon. This is what I want us to do. I want to do two things because I've noticed a theme in some of the questions in the chat, and I also have a direction from our eponym, from the center, the namesake of our center, Dr. Bill Pinnell himself. He reached out to me and emailed me, and he said he wanted to make sure that the Pinnell Center for Black Church Studies said something to and for the church. So I want panelists to be thinking, what would be a word or something you would want to speak if literally, I mean, this almost sounds like a bad joke. A historian, a psychologist, and a director log into a Zoom room, right? And say something about the Black church, right? But I really want you to be thinking, if you could just summarize something that you wanted to, if we could put the Black church up on the screen, and we wanted to say something to the Black church and maybe even by way to the global church, global body of Christ. I wanted to hear from that. And while you're getting your thoughts together, let me respond as our host to some of the questions in the chat. Some of the questions in the chat have to do with allyship, which is important, which is necessary, about how do we do this? How do we stand with, and how do we move into neighborhoods and not just be a part of gentrification? And those are important questions, and they need attention. But what tends to happen in these spaces when we have these meetings, tends to happen is the ally questions tend to predominate the conversation. And instead of this being a life-affirming space for Black people and people of diasporic ancestry, it becomes a space where now we feel the obligation to have to tell our non-Black counterparts how to do A, B, C, and D. And I don't want to dismiss those questions at all. I'm hear my words. They are valid questions. And depending on if we have time at the very end, we might get into a little bit, but this space is absolutely necessary for us to affirm a particular experience, to affirm particular perspectives and worldviews. And that's the only reason why I haven't gotten to several of those questions. So if you want to be upset, you can be upset with Dr. Dwight Anthony Radcliffe Jr. Please don't be upset with our panelists or any of our event staff. That's a decision that I've made because I've been in enough of these settings to know how they tend to operate. And then we go from feeling as though we're being nourished feeling as though our souls are being nourished, to then flipping into counselor mode, then flipping into pastoral mode, and feeling as though we have to then tend to and minister to everyone else. So I've been trying to keep this space a little bit sacred today. That's just my approach. And, again, if you got fault with that, holla at your boy. So back to the thought that Dr. Bill Pinnell is urging us to say, what would we say to the Black church, my sisters, my brothers, whoever? Just come on in, jump on in.
A few years ago, oh, go ahead, Dr. Bobo, you go first.
Okay, I will say two things. I find it so heartbreaking. I taught undergrads for 7 years from churches, including Black Baptist churches. And so this is probably more of a worldwide phenomenon, but nonetheless, it's quite sad that our young people lack critical thinking skills. So I would strongly encourage the church to teach our young people, teach their parishioners how to think. And then the second is tied to this statement. My ethics professor at seminary said, God has ordained 3 institutions for the sake of human flourishing: the civil government, the family, and the church. My strong encouragement or challenge to the Black church is help the family be the family. And related to that, the church needs to ask herself in a community where God has providentially placed that church, where God has providentially equipped that church, what is that church doing for the flourishing of the community where it sits? And if it's not causing flourishing in that community where it sits, it's not being the church.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Right on. That's exactly where I was headed, Dr. Bobo, is that a few years ago I was doing a simulation assignment at LMU with other faculty, and we were doing like a 10.0 earthquake hits LA, blah, blah, blah. And we went through these stages, and this was really an ethical exercise. So we go through these stages of day 1 of shutdown, immediately after the earthquake, and all of this. So we get to a point where now we found that some people want to come to campus because they need provisions, right? And somebody said, well, we're not that far from Inglewood. So what about, like, how do we know that those people aren't going to be trying to come over here? We're in Westchester. And I just looked at the woman and I said, Black people, if you're talking about Black people, they're going to go to their church. That's where they're going to go for help, is the church. They're not going down the street a few miles or whatever to some tiny little university up on a hill, to see if they can get in and get help. They're going to go to the church first. And so my point is that the church is and this was where we started, the church is so important to the Black community, that the church operates in the Black community in so many more ways than just a place of religious and spiritual guidance. And I believe that the church needs to continue doing that, and sometimes needs to do that more. We're here today because we're honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? We're remembering him. And he came from the church, right? It was the church that got all of this started in the civil rights movement and the era. It was the church leaders who were the outspoken. And we need to go back to that. And we need to do it a lot more. But I also think we need to understand the community around us and embrace the community as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Marne.
Thank you for sharing, Dr. Campbell. Dr. Radcliffe, thank you for passing along Dr. Pinnell's message to us. That is encouraging. It sounds like him to have that kind of final word. I'm
trying to stay out of trouble. Stay out of trouble.
Stay out of trouble. You just got to that position. It's such a good question, and it's one that I want to sit with for longer, but as I've been sitting here for the last few minutes, a few things that come to my mind, and they have to do with like development, acknowledging the different stages of the people who make up the church, those who are youth, those who are in the sandwich generation, and those who are our elders. And I want to go in the reverse order, starting with our elders. I want to acknowledge the significance of honoring those who have come before us. And I know that's something that often we hear in Black churches. If we have an older generation who is sitting or presiding, is the importance of honor. And honor looks different. Honor is even interpreted differently, right? Based on even generational understandings of honor. And we have to acknowledge that. That gets to be tricky. What does it mean to honor you? What does it mean for you to honor me? Though our positions are different, our age is different. But honoring the stories of elders, I think honoring the perspectives of elders, I think is really key. And I'm just reminded of the significance of oral history. The last 2 or 3 years, as I've gone back to Michigan to see my grandmother in particular, and I think she might be on this call, it's been wonderful to actually go back and to ask her about her story. How did you get to be the way you are? How did you get to be someone who's 79, who's going back to grad school when you just graduated college 3 years ago? Like, how did that happen? Like, tell me your story. Tell me what seeds were planted in you by your parents that I can learn from. I'm reminded of the Old Testament that talks about setting up stones of Ebenezer, those stones of remembrance. And I think the stories that our elders are able to pass on to us from our ancestors through them to us are able to stabilize us. They are grounding for us to have these stones of Ebenezer. I think about the sandwich generation that my mom and dad and their siblings stand in between, right? Those who are youth and those who are older. And I think it's necessary that we sustain them, that those of us who are younger figure out how do we sustain them? How do we keep them going, not only physically, right? Get those checkups, get those other things going on, but emotionally and spiritually as they're sustaining the generation ahead of them, and often financially sustaining the generation coming up behind them. So sustaining that sandwich generation, I think, becomes really important. But I also think it becomes really important to amplify the voices of youth. I really think it's important to amplify the voices of youth. And earlier, a moment ago, Dr. Bobo was talking about the significance of critical thinking. That's my #1 learning course objective in every syllabus of every class that I teach. And my new students next week will see that in the syllabus. But I think when students actually are using their critical thinking skills, there isn't always a place for us to hear the critical thinking, the critical reasoning that they have engaged with in the world around them. And so making a space for youth to be able to share to us becomes very important. And it's a tricky thing to figure out how do we honor those who are older than us and also make space to amplify, to prepare youth to actually have the positions of leadership that they're called into. And so I want to end with this final comment. I've been reflecting this last month on the story of Samuel, the very young boy who is given to God before he is born. He is consecrated to the Lord and he is taken to the temple. And the final thing I want to say is when he is young, he learns to hear the voice of God, but he only learns to hear because Eli is the one who says to him, this is how you discern the Lord's voice. And often we stop at that part of the story, but we actually know if we keep reading a few verses later, Samuel is told about some curses that are coming to Eli and his family because of Eli's poor fathership. And it's significant to me to see the posture of Eli to tell Samuel, the young boy, even if God has given you something that is a critique for me, a critique for my family, a critique for my generation, you listen to the voice of God and I want to hear what you have to say. And Samuel hesitated because he knew the word was hard as prophecy is. And so I want to say that I think there's importance for us humbly to make space for those younger than us, younger than me, to be able to speak as God has given them, as they're learning to discern that voice of God on our behalf for us, for the sake of the kingdom and for the sake of the church.
Work the text, Dr. Ford. Vince.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect text all day because that's exactly what it was in the exact same line that I was thinking, Dr. Ford. Thank you so much because I'm gonna get in more trouble and say like, if we're talking about sacred space, we're talking about us, the Black church, we don't make room for the youth to really speak. And I'm with the honoring the elders, all that. Don't want to take away from none of that. But look, 13 to 30 in the Black church, it ain't there. It ain't there. And where they going to get lies on the block, from other religions that are saying Christianity is a white man's religion. But guess what? Those other religions is on the block, and they over here talking about we got to build, like Dr. Campbell said, we got to build our own Black dollars. They talking about Black identity. Look, in my thing, like the Black folks in general, but especially the young folks, and especially in the hood, especially low income and young, all that. We're talking about economics today. folks is hungry for two things that the Black church ain't given, and Christianity as a whole definitely ain't given. And that is, as it's expressed dominantly today. And in my mind, that is, number one, a sense of Black pride and identity, and being able to say, I'm Black and proud. And like Dr. Campbell was saying, embracing who we are as Black people and not feeling like, oh, but I'm a Christian first. I hate when people say, my Christian identity is more important than my Black. Like, that ain't, where is that in the Bible? Where do we bifurcate and kind of like segment and compartmentalize who we are? Blackness is made in God's image. Mm-hmm. I always tell people by like me being a Christian, that don't make me less Black. It made me more Black, because now I've been filled up with the Holy Spirit and I'm being redeemed and sanctified as a Black man. I'm gonna become a better Black man.
That's right.
The way to be really Black is to be a Christian, is to be a follower of Jesus. That don't take me further away from my Blackness. Be a Christian, so I'm gonna start trying to de-emphasize my Black. I'm gonna be the blackest person in the world in Jesus' name. And so the Bible says like I am Black and beautiful. Songs 1 and 5. She doesn't say, don't read them Bibles that say I am Black but beautiful. It says I am Black and beautiful. Those things are not contradictory statements. So we got to give unapologetically a sense of Black is beautiful. And also I think people are hungry for a sense of justice. That where is the church? I saw in the comments that the Black church, we talk about Dr. King, we need to go back to Dr. King. That's what we need to do. We need to do what he did. Look, in the 60s, the Black church was at the front lines of the civil rights movement. We're in the middle of a 6-year-long civil rights movement. Where's the Black church? Woo. Black church in this current civil rights movement that we haven't. They ain't there. And you can't trick me when I show up to the march and I see like 5 Black people in the front leading and I see 1,000 white college students behind you. Come on now, this ain't no Black movement. This is a white liberal college student movement. And I'm with it. I go to the marches, but I'm just saying like I don't see the Black church at the marches, and I don't see people in the hood either. Because I be talking to homies in the project like, hey man, you wanna go to Black Lives Matter? I ain't trying to go to no Black, what is that? I don't even know what that is. Like, and so I'm saying like that, and it's exactly what I think it was Dr. Campbell was saying earlier. Black folk in the community go to the church. You know what I'm saying? They go to but where is the church? Where are we showing up? We have a history and a legacy of the Black church of when we was boy, when we was nigger, when we was this or that in the streets, we was elder and deacon and minister and pastor.
That's right.
The church building on
That's
Sunday.
Right.
So the Black church has given people whose dignity was attacked, restoring that dignity. How can we do that? And I would just end with this last thing, that we need to also be able to empower, especially the poor in the church. We don't need to be worrying about our presentations being flashy or our building being like a stadium or all that kind of stuff. We need to have Keisha and Tyrone and all of them from the projects in leadership in the church, not just, when you can get the right clothes, when you the right social networks, when you can do all this kind of stuff, then you will graduate to. No, we need to have people in the I used to pastor a church in North St. Louis where we would have people giving the announcements in church that had like a 3rd grade reading level. And we would have people greeting at the door that was living in the projects and they had holes in their shirt. We would have people serving communion from the pulpit. I'm saying like, and that restores the dignity. The church has that opportunity and that thing. And Dr. King did that because in 67, when he was in Chicago, he was fighting for housing rights and he lived in the hood. And here come Black church folks saying, no, don't live there. Don't live there. That's the hood. That's Lawndale. And Dr. King was like, get out of here. I'm going to be with my people. We're going to fight for housing rights. Then when he did the march at Soldiers Field, he had the disciples and he had the thugs and he had them marching with him. And they was like, oh no, we ain't doing this. There's too many thugs. These is Black church people saying, we're not doing that. That's thugs and all that kind of stuff. We have that opportunity though. Let's not just be in the building, but commute in on Sunday morning.
Come on.
So, but let's actually be in the community before the community.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me add my 2 cents. I feel like we're doing a tag team revival. So let me let me bring my 2 cents here. I think that to culminate what's being said here, having attended rallies held by and spearheaded by, specifically by the Black church, let me articulate what I've seen. The leadership of the Black church being almost always Black men over 50. They come out, they get their photo opportunities with the law enforcement, with the political leaders, they get their private audiences. And then after their 30 minutes of fame, they leave and the youth are still there waiting for the real protest and end up carrying on without them. So I think for me, the text that keeps coming to my mind is Joshua 24. Joshua 24 Joshua is up in age, and he's telling them that you're going to have to put away your idols and serve the Lord. And the people keep saying, yeah, we got you. We're going to serve God. And he's like, no, you're going to put away your idols and serve God alone. And they're like, yes, that's what we're doing. We would never leave God. That's what they say. They said we would never leave God. And he comes back and says, no, I don't think you get it. You're not even able to serve God because God is a jealous God and has no idols, and God will not deal with that. And they're like, no, we will serve God alone. And then after this back and forth, Josh was like, well, if you really about it, if you about that life, then why don't you destroy your idols? And it's interesting to me, my message to the church, to the Black church and to the wider church in America, and then to the global church, is that we have spent way too much time professing to follow God and protecting our idols. Now we can name those idols in the Black church. They are sexism, they are ageism, they are heterosexism. We can name, they are classism. It is hierarchy. It is positional, because the pastor is the only one who is, quote unquote, the man in the church, and nobody else is worth anything. And that's why there's such a hierarchy that if you're a youth pastor, you're only a youth pastor because you're a youth pastor en route to being a senior pastor. Everybody wants to be either the senior pastor or the head deacon. There is no sense of calling. There is no sense of purpose anywhere else in the church. The only anointed people are the preacher and the singer. I'm waiting for 3 amens to drop in the comment section. I'm gonna keep going for a minute, but it's hilarious to me that we have continued to profess our allegiance to God, but protected our idols. If we go to the larger church in America, racism is our idol, privilege is our idol. Come on, we can name all the idols. And so I've just arrived at a moment in my walk with God where I don't want to hear about it anymore. I don't want to do kumbaya anymore. I don't want to hear your theory. I don't want to hold hands anymore. If we're not willing to destroy idols, then we're not ready to be the church. If we're not ready to destroy idols, we're not ready to be the church. The humiliation of what Joshua encounters with the people of God in that argument is that they are arguing that they would never leave God. It is those who are married and have a side piece. I would never leave my marriage for my side piece. But the problem is that the marital covenant is demanding fidelity, and the side piece is only demanding a little time here and there. And so what we've actually done then, by maintaining the side piece and keeping God's name, as it were, in marriage, is we've actually broken the covenant with God and professed our allegiance to the idol that says, we don't care if you leave your marriage as long as you keep us around. And so my message to the church would be, we've got to be ready to do the work of destroying idols, not talking about it, but being about it. The words of MLK this week, as we've gone through this speech, are prophetic to me, not just in the tradition of the Black prophetic preaching tradition that they are speaking truth to power, but they are also foretelling. When I hear King's words today, it's like listening to Marvin Gaye's What's Going On from 1971. It's like listening to Tupacalypse Now by Tupac in 1991. So much of what King has said and what Gaye has sung and what Pac has rapped is still happening right now. And if the church will not destroy the idols, then we don't have the ability to be the church. And that is my 2 cents on it.
Let the church say amen.
Amen, amen.
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 Dr. Marne Campbell, my sister, thank you so much for being with us, for doing this work and doing the work you are doing. We bless you on the campus of Loyola Marymount. My sister, Dr. Christin, who we had classes together and helped to run the Africana Student Association together here on Fuller's campus. I bless you and I thank you for taking the time and bringing your whole person to this work today. Bless you at Wheaton College. To Dr. Luke Bobo, who we had a chance to meet and connect. Thank God for Brother Vince connecting us. May God continue to allow you to flourish through your work at Made to Flourish. Dr. Bantu, my brother, as we work here at this institution and just in our communities and speak truth to power into the church, I thank you all so much for your work, for the ability to bring your whole selves to this work. To our administration, to our faculty, to our staff, to our students, and to our larger Fuller community, to the 400 people that have registered for this event this week, to the 400, YG 400, to the 400 that have registered for this event this week. We bless you and we thank you all for your time. That's all that we've got for you today. Join us tomorrow, 10 a.m., as I get a chance to have a live conversation with our guest this week, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Take care.